Episode 18, Romans 13, and David Lipscomb's Civil Government.
The Anarcho-Christian Podcast, evaluating the relationship between the Christian and the state.
Hi everyone, welcome back. Today I'm going to be diving into a very controversial topic, and that is Romans 13. But before we begin, and if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button on whatever podcatcher you're using so not to miss any future episodes. And if you're not sure where to find us, visit anarchochristian.com/subscribe. There you'll find links to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Android, Google Play, and YouTube. If you're also enjoying the podcast, please consider letting us know by leaving a 5-star rating and review on iTunes or wherever you catch the episodes. It'll help us reach more listeners and grow the show. And you can support the show with a one-time or monthly donation through Patreon. If you're interested, visit the support tab on anarchochristian.com. That will take you to our Patreon page where you'll find a few ways to support us. So if you like what we're doing, hit the link and check out the options for support. Alright, if you've listened to this show for a while or followed us on Facebook, you might have heard me mention David Lipscomb's Civil Government. It's one of my favorite books overall, and as far as a book that concerns anarchism and Christianity, it's my favorite. You might usually hear Tolstoy or Ellul mentioned, before Lipscomb in most cases. Their names definitely are bigger in the Christian anarchism or just anarchism in general, really. Their names are really more popular, but personally, David Lipscomb and his book, Civil Government, or you might hear it referred to as On Civil Government, is really my favorite. It's the most, I think, comprehensive from a specifically Bible-driven, Bible-inspired take on the Christian's role and the Christian's responsibility when it comes to government. So what I'd like to do is get into a portion of his book that I think addresses one of the most popular critiques or objections or topics in Christian anarchism, and that is the infamous Romans 13. So, on top of this being my favorite book, coincidentally, it has, in my opinion, the best handling on Romans 13. And this, of course, isn't just the best handling as far as Christian anarchism is concerned. This is just the best handling on Romans 13. And like so many other passages that we go over, if it's 1 Samuel or Romans or any other portion of the Bible, we're not just examining it through this lens of anarchism. We are examining it outside of the lens of nationalism, which that has completely skewed so many of these verses and so many just books, and it's something that we're getting away from. And so I don't want anyone to mistake that this isn't just reading in an anarchism, anti-state narrative into these chapters. This is handling it as it is. And what we get from that is an anti-state understanding. So I'd like to get into this portion of the book. It comes from section 2 of Civil Government, and the subtitle for Civil Government is Its Origin, Mission, and Destiny, and the Christian's relation to it. So in section 2, we see David Lipscomb handling the New Testament and civil government specifically. So there's 4 sections, and he walks us through so many books of the Bible, topics in the Bible, and always just relating this idea of government to the Christian. And he walks us through events in the Bible, events in history, and so in section 2 is when he handles Romans 13. So I'd like to start. This is about halfway through the chapter, and after bringing up multiple verses from the Bible, just kind of from different places in the New Testament, he ends up getting to Romans 13. So I'll read a couple of passages from here, and maybe interject a little bit as as I come to it. So he starts this portion of it as: the letter to the Christians at Rome was written by the Apostle Paul during the reign of Nero, the most cruel and wicked persecutor of the Church of God, as well as the most depraved and personal character that ever sat upon the throne of the Roman Empire. His residence was in Rome, where these Christians dwelt. They were the special objects of Nero's hatred. He accused them of setting fire to the city as an excuse for gratifying his own ferocious spirit. Renan says, quote, "Never before had such refinements of cruelty been witnessed. The usual punishment of such unfortunates was to be thrown to wild beasts, or to be burned in the amphitheater, with an addition of cruel scourgings. Poor timid maidens, who, with modest gestures, veiling their nudity, were tossed by a bull and torn into pieces on the pebbles of the arena." End quote. I'd also like to point out that Tacitus has a very famous portion in one of his books where he was a Roman historian, and he also documented Nero's accusations against the Christians about the setting of the fire in the city. But to get back to it, Lipscomb continues: "They were put to death not for the public good, but to gratify the cruelty of one man. These Christians at Rome, enduring these things, were liable to be excited to take vengeance in their own hands and rise up and slay or burn out their cruel persecutors. But Paul, writing to them, admonishes them." And this is where Lipscomb quotes a large portion of Romans. And interestingly enough, he doesn't just start at Romans 13:1. And this is a kind of a touchy subject for people addressing the Romans 13 issue. Any accusations against anti-state Christians, it always, what about Romans 13? And it starts out at Romans 13:1. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, and it covers the next 6 or 7 verses. But most people will rightly point out that Romans when Paul wrote it, this was a single letter. It didn't just start at Romans 13. He didn't write out the chapters and verses. That came much later as Christians put together the books. So Lipscomb starts us at Romans 12:17, and I think this is good. In most cases, when you're reading the Bible and you want to get an idea of what is going on in whatever particular passage or verse, you want to start. Rule of thumb for me is at least 3 verses up. So if you're looking at Romans 13:1, you need to back up at least 3 verses into Romans 12. And I say at least. That's just my rule of thumb. Usually from there you'll see, some context and maybe even need to back up a little bit more. So Lipscomb backs us up to Romans 12:17. Recompense to no man evil for evil. Provide things honest in the sight of all men. If it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath, for it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Therefore, if thine enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. If in so doing thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head, but be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou not then be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Wherever ye must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience' sake. For this cause pay ye tribute also, for they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. Render to all therefore their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. And that concludes the portion of Romans that Lipscomb lists, and that ends in Romans 13, verse 7 in our numbering system. And I should have, warned you ahead of time that this book was written around 1886. That's when it was compiled. Prior to that, 1885, 84, I believe, it first appeared in various Christian publications in pieces. So 1800s, he's writing from the King James version. So I would definitely recommend, if some of those words kind of skip past you, or the sentence structure, which of course obviously tripped me up a little bit, read it from an ESV, an NIV, something to kind of help you with the modern vernacular. And I always recommend ESV. That's my personal favorite. The Holman is also a good one. So continuing on with Lipscomb, he says, this is the most complete statement of the Christian's relation to the civil government found in the New Testament. Accepting as we do that the higher powers here refer to the civil government. Many hold that this passage refers to church authorities, but this application involved difficulties, to my mind, inexplicable. So I believe that the higher powers refer to civil government. The Holy Spirit then warns these Christians that they must not avenge themselves. They must suffer wrong, for it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Christians are forbidden to take vengeance, God will avenge their wrongs. The higher powers are immediately introduced as God's agency through which he will take vengeance and execute wrath. We found that he so used the wicked nations under the Old Testament dispensation. This higher power is a revenger to execute wrath on him that doeth evil. The Christian has been clearly forbidden to take vengeance or execute wrath, but he is to live peaceably with all men, to do good for evil. Then, a Christian cannot be an officer or executor of this higher power. Human governments we found in the Old Testament, as Babylon, Assyria, and others, were ordained of God and used to punish other wicked nations. Kings and rulers were used as my servants to punish wicked people. And then he quotes from Psalms here, "But God maketh the wrath of men to praise him. The remainder of wrath will he restrain." Psalm 76:10. God uses the wrath of man to promote his own praise for the greatest good of his people. Wrath that would go beyond this, God will restrain. With these thoughts, this higher power is ordained of God, as all human government is, to punish those who refuse to obey God. The civil ruler is a minister of wrath, whom God uses to punish wickedness and rebellion. The government, which he here calls his ordinance, is the Roman, in direct line of descent from that of Babylon, through that of Medo-Persia and of Greece. He whom he calls the minister of God is the vile persecuting Nero, with his subordinates. How can he be said to be a, quote, minister of thee for good? In the same sense that, quote, all things work together for good to them that love the Lord, end quote. In the same sense that he makes the wrath of man to praise him, while the remainder of wrath, which would inflict more punishment than would redound to his praise, he restrains. So much of wrath as promotes the true good of God's children, he permits to come upon them. All that would go beyond that, God restrains. In the same sense that Nebuchadnezzar was his servant, that Babylon was his battle axe, then all the persecutions that came upon the Christians, even in the days of Nero, were needed by the children of God to promote their true and eternal welfare. All the afflictions that were to come upon them were for their good. They are for their good in the courses they pursue, in the position in which they place themselves. In different courses, they would not be needed for their good. One chief good was to wean them from the love of the kingdoms of the world. How can this wicked ruler be a terror of evil works and not to good? Because if God permits only so much punishment to come upon his children as will promote their true good, all the evil that comes upon them is intended by God to restrain and deter them from sin, and to encourage them to do good. Besides, it is true that the essentials to all quiet, stable government are such as to make evil men in authority prefer goodness, forbearance, quiet, and industry. The qualities inculcated by the Christian religion to the turbulent, disorderly, and rebellious spirit, the concomitant of sin and godlessness. And it is only when there is animosity toward good men on account of fidelity to principle, or to parties that are offensive and that are persecuted for their principles, that even wicked and tyrannical rulers would not encourage and reward the orderly, quiet spirit in preference to the disorderly and wicked. And God overrules the most wicked government to the destruction of the wicked. All government, then, is a terror to evildoers and not to good. This is true of hell itself. So, that concludes the portion of Romans 13. He then goes further into the chapter talking about God's ordinances, God's servants, and continues to use Bible verses and to really flesh out his entire point. But I want to just kind of go back through a little bit of that. I get tripped up a little bit with some of the old verbiage, and but I think that a big point that he's making in the last portion there is something that we point to quite a bit in the church, where we look at the church at any point in history growing under persecution. And it's somewhat of a phenomenon because we don't get it. We sit back in our very comfortable lives and we go to church every Sunday, and we talk about church growth and the growth of faith and people making commitments to God every Sunday and things of that nature. But we also know, on the other hand, that we've seen real growth whenever the church is persecuted. And we see that during this time of Nero. We see it today in places like China. And it's happened all throughout time where we have these areas that are under heavy persecution. And yet those are the areas that seem to give us a real sense of revival and a real sense of faith. And it's that persecution that, we're not just talking about people aren't allowed to say Merry Christmas, or, maybe they only get one Bible per home or something like that. We're talking about people being murdered by their government. And here Lipscomb is showing that, and this is one of the more difficult portions of trying to understand what Paul is saying here in Romans 13, that this terror that the government that Nero is doing, it's keeping God's children from worshiping the state. It's keeping their eyes fixed on God. It's keeping their hearts toward God. It's keeping their minds on God, remembering God's word that He will revenge. He will avenge them, that they are not to do that. And it's a tough understanding that I think when you start looking at what people in China and what these people were going through under Nero, what they were having to go through, the real faith that they were having to have in God, that it's something that we can't even really understand in our more modern and accepting cultures of the Christian religion. So I know that was a lot to take in. I know that is a lot that really you can't just read once, totally understand it, totally get exactly what Paul is saying, what Lipscomb is saying, how he's expressing it. So I definitely recommend listen to this again. Pick up the book, pick up the audio book. I'll have links in the show notes, and it's something to look at. If you have a friend, if you're totally on board, if you've already got this, send this to your friend that is asking about Romans 13. I think that there are a number of ways that Romans 13 is interpreted. One of them obviously being the way that it's brought up against the individual that's anti-state, and for lack of a better word, that would be what we would call the statist interpretation. And that usually plays out as whatever the state does, it's ordained by God, and so it must be great. Now, of course, that's always coming from the perspective of an American that loves their country and their nation, and there's all manner of symbolism that's mixed into that, where we tend to mix a lot of the promises or blessings from God that we read in the Bible, and we just kind of assign that to the United States. So other than that, there's a few ways that anti-state or libertarian anarchist individuals might look at it. In this way, the way that Lipscomb defines it, I think the best kind of phrase that he came up with was that Babylon was God's battle axe. And that's a similar way that I've used it before. I've said that government is a tool of God's. So the best way that I guess I could say this is that it's the interpretation of government being God's tool. Now, you don't worship a tool. You don't necessarily think that the tool is the greatest thing, and just because the tool's there, then it's been ordained by God in such a way that you would, sing hymns or, have flags for the tool. So one of the other prominent understandings from the anti-state perspective is that the state that Romans 13 is referring to would be a perfect state. And so that's not really an interpretation you get at all from Lipscomb. But I would like to bring that up in future episodes. That's, of course, an interpretation that's much better than the statist one. I don't necessarily feel that the context of everything points towards it, but I know many great individuals that's the way that they interpret Romans 13. So I think that it definitely has a lot of merit, and I don't think that you're going to get a lot of infighting and bickering in between the interpretation of the tool or the righteous government interpretation. Other than that, you might hear some people refer to Romans 13 as church authority, which I believe Lipscomb brought up, and that's something that I know is out there. It obviously was in the 1800s when he was writing this, but there's not a lot of people today that will really use that as the interpretation of it. And last but not least, I'd say that I've most encountered would be something that I read from Elul. So he's the first person that I read that expressed it in this way, and that was that Romans 13 really shouldn't be considered at all. That it was a mistake. Maybe Paul was, off his rocker at that moment. I don't agree with that interpretation at all. I definitely hold to inerrancy when it comes to the Bible. I think that just because it's difficult, as Romans 13 is difficult to kind of dig into, especially considering the whatever the current civil government may be, I still think that it's inspired by God. I still think that it should be included in everything. So that's where I definitely break with Elul there, even though don't let that distract you. He has some great writing. So definitely don't let that deter you from reading Elul's work. But as difficult as it may be, whatever Elul was thinking of when he wrote that, I believe maybe sometime in the 60s, I'd have to double check on that, but whatever he was seeing that brought him to that interpretation, I think that the background that David Lipscomb brings up before he dives into it, letting us know who the emperor was, with Nero giving us a little bit of historical background on just how bad Nero was to the Christians at the time. I can't imagine a time period for the church to be more stunned by Paul's words in Romans 13. But it was written to them at that time. They're looking at what he's saying. They're looking at what they're going through. They're examining it in light of their scriptures from the Old Testament and possibly even other epistles that we hold today, in our New Testament, and really understanding that even though they're going through this, that it's not the Christian's role to react violently to the state, to take vengeance, to repay evil for evil. And that's really why Paul, wrote this. That's why Lipscomb starts us off partway through Romans 12. So, like I said, it is a lot to take in, especially how at this time it is a completely different understanding of the way most of us have probably been introduced to Romans 13. So listen to this again. Read Romans 13 over and over again. Read Romans 12. Pick up David Lipscomb's book and really dig into it. And if you are of the opinion that Romans 13 is pointing to the righteous nation, that's great. I think that we can still find many similarities on the way that we're supposed to, as Christians, react toward our current government, whether you have the tool interpretation or the righteous government interpretation. So with that, I appreciate your time. Like I said, it's a lot to take in, and I recommend that everyone do it. It's important stuff. So until next time, grace and peace, no king but Christ.
Christian Podcast. Subscribe to our email notifications at anarchochristian.com. Like us on Facebook.com/anarchochristian and follow us on Twitter at anarchoxp. Subscribe to our podcast and YouTube to join us next time as we continue to evaluate the relationship between the Christian and the state. No king but Christ.
This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.